You can be seated. We've heard, and I always like to present what you've heard, what the world says, to get these things in perspective, because you're coming out of the world and you're coming in here, and we see that as we need to wash our feet constantly because of what we've walked through in the world, is another example that the Bible does actually bridge the gap between God and man and the things that we are affected by in the world. So we have these familiar sayings regarding speech in the world. We've heard these things in the world. One of them is, don't let the cat out of the bag. Now, I don't need to get into too much detail, but it has to do with saying something that you shouldn't say, and now there's all kinds of destruction behind it. Nothing against cats, but that's basically what this saying had meant. Another one, the other ones I don't really have to explain. One of them is loose lips sink ships. Has to do with how you handle your mouth. Here's one, maybe you've heard. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. You've heard that one as a kid on the playground. How about this one? The so-called Freudian slip. We've heard of that. We see then that even in the world, the tongue can cause major problems. It can make things uncomfortable. It could cause you problems. But the Bible calls the misuse of the tongue sin. So maybe it causes you big problems out in the world, which we'll see some of those today, but the Bible calls it sin. And here we go with sins of the other body parts. Sins of your other body parts have built-in obstacles. In other words, you can't just freely do the sins with your other body members as easily as you can with your tongue. There's other obstacles, such as obstacles that require then and opportunities that must come for you to sin with your other body parts. In other words, there needs to be gates to be opened to practice sin with other body parts that you have. In other words, you need a person to murder. You can't just murder without a person to murder. You need money to steal or some other thing. You can't steal something if there's nothing to steal. So there's other obstacles put in, or measures, or even safeguards that keep you from murdering and stealing 24/7. But the tongue can sin anytime, anywhere. And with this, only the mind has greater freedom to sin, but then the tongue will eventually reveal it anyway. So even the mind doesn't really have the opportunity to really sin very easily, because it's going to come out. The cat's going to come out of the bag, so to speak. The tongue will eventually reveal what's inside. The tongue is listed in the Bible as creating the vilest of sin. Psalm 5:9 speaks about these evil ones. Their throat is an open grave. Wow, it's not even talking about their murderers' hands or their feet that are swift to go to sin, but it hits it right where it counts. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Wow, that's Psalm 5:9. We also see it in Romans 3:13 and 14. Isaiah, the prophet, viewed his tongue as his greatest problem when he said, with great fear before the Lord. The first thing he said when face to face, so to speak, with the Lord, or let's call it in the presence of the Lord, this is what he said, Isaiah 6:5. He says, "Woe is me, for I am ruined." Why did he say that? He says this, because I am a man of unclean lips. His whole thing was, oh no, I'm in big trouble because I have sinned with my mouth. The tongue represents the spokesman for the heart, and it's the real personality of the person. Jesus says this in Matthew 12:34, the mouth speaks out that which fills the heart. And Jesus continues with that same passage, and that every careless word will be judged. Wow. What happened to sticks and stones and break my bones, but words can never hurt or hurt me? Wow, the Bible's hitting this hard. Adam and Eve's second sin was with their tongue, in blaming each other and the serpent and everybody else, including God. The book of Numbers, the whole book of Numbers discusses this situation. The tongue caused the greatest problems for the Israelites in the wilderness with their grumbling. The whole book of Numbers, in fact, the key word when you study the book of Numbers is the fact that it's all about the grumbling that had occurred, that had made God angry. The whole book of Numbers is about the grumbling and the sin of grumbling. The tongue is supposed to speak and sing praises to God. Psalm 35:28. And my tongue shall declare your righteousness and your praise all day long. And throughout the Psalms, we know that we are supposed to use our tongue to bless God and bless others. True believers will have already a sanctified tongue, but a true believer must maintain his sanctified tongue. As a new believer, you've gotten a whole new heart, which means then that you have a new tongue, or a tongue that's set apart to go along with the new heart, but you still have to maintain it, as every Christian in this room knows. So what we see here in James, we are in the book of James. James chapter 3, verses 1 to 12 gives us 5 reasons. It gives 5 reasons why you must tame the untamable tongue, so that you will bless God and others, and even bless yourself. So we see that James had initially addressed the tongue in James 1, 26 and 27. And with this, he said back then, he said that Christians must bridle the tongue. But now in this passage, as we will see, but now he says that it can't be done. So today we're going to examine this dilemma. He commands that we bridle the tongue, and then today we're going to see that in this passage that it can't be done. So let's look at this first. Let's see this whole thing. Let's see these 5 reasons why you must tame the untamable tongue. First of all, in verse 1, we see in verse 1 of James chapter 3, the tongue condemns. That's the first reason that you need to manage your tongue, because it condemns. Verse 1, let not many of you become teachers, my brethren, knowing that as such we, he's speaking of us teachers, will incur a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. The tongue condemns. And so this context then has to do with speech. With this, improper use of the tongue will incur judgment, which is, as we see here, especially dangerous for teachers. This warning is to those thinking about being teachers for the wrong motives. That's what the warning is for. And we see that going on today, and a lot today, with teachers wanting to become teachers for the wrong motives, and it was going on back then too. And we see back in the Bible, in all these verses, false teachers take advantage of people, especially women, for self-gain, and they will be judged. 1 Timothy 6:3, 2 Peter 2, Jude 8, 10, and 16. False teachers will be judged on what comes out of their mouth, because they are doing it for the sake of taking advantage of somebody, and they will be judged. They are using their tongue for self-motivational reasons. Teachers will incur a stricter judgment. In other words, this describes anyone in an official teaching or preaching role. And for this reason, the Bible lays out qualifications for preachers and teachers, which is basically the same role. 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. And therefore, we learn in 1 Timothy 3 that it is not for those immature in their walk to become preachers or teachers because it could lead to their conceit and therefore lead to a sinful tongue. So you have to be careful with this. Teachers and preachers have a greater chance of harming someone with their speech. Jesus warns against anyone who would cause one of his to stumble. Matthew 18:6. As soon as a preacher or teacher opens his mouth, he is immediately under stricter judgment. He's immediately under stricter judgment. Preaching the word will always be offensive to those perishing, so let's just get that out of the way. That's always going to happen when the preacher or teacher is speaking of the Bible. It will always be offensive to them. But we see that 1 Corinthians 1:18. But we are not to personally offend people. So the word of God will offend people. And let me tell you, it offends the natural man. And let me tell you that as a preacher is approaching the new text for the week, that it jabs and it hurts. And there's a lot of ouch going on there because we're all in this together when it comes to that. But teachers have a greater chance of failing because they speak more than others. So you can look at it either way, but you probably hear me speak to you than I hear you speak to me. But here we see in Proverbs 10:19, where when there are many words, transgression is unavoidable. But he who restrains his lips is wise. So when there's many words, transgression is unavoidable. Wow, that's hard, because the more you speak, the more chance you have of sinning with your mouth. But he who restrains his lips is wise. Proverbs 10:19. Teachers can become complacent while being used to public speaking. They could be complacent. They can have a false confidence. They can have a false confidence with the perceived approval of their flock. In other words, thinking I can just let my tongue just fly because the people here like me. You've got to be careful. They have less chance of confrontational correction by anyone. In other words, I can be up here and preach, and there's not too many times when somebody's going to stand up and argue with me, which means I have less of a feeling of accountability in that way. That could be a temptation. Preachers and teachers, and keep in mind, I'm talking about Farron out in the lobby there, who's also a teacher, and we're going to get into that. But as we'll see in a few minutes, is that everyone here is a teacher one way or another. So keep this in mind. This isn't just Dave, pay attention to this stuff. Preacher or teachers have a captive audience. They have already established themselves as a godly man in their eyes. Oh, it must be okay with what he's saying because he's supposedly a godly man. Teachers can have a temptation for laughs or applause. A teacher can have the temptation to create laughs or applause. They can have a false sense of security in their role. And they can have more confidence then to be a bully from the pulpit, or from the podium, or from wherever they're teaching. They can cause more damage as a result of the frequency of speech and the publicity of speech and the trust that they have already gained by the people listening. With this, they must not be sinful in their speech nor inaccurate in teaching the word. Exodus 27 is very clear on not using the Lord's name in vain. It's black and white. Everybody knows this. Even unbelievers know this. Yet, the Bible uses many words that are offensive to the world. So we know that one word to be used in the context of the word of God, used in the context of doing this in vain, or something that's not the correct contents to speak the word God, is sinful. But there's a lot of words in the Bible that are offensive just by themselves. Particular words are offensive to not only Christians saying ouch, but words that the world says, wow, that's a bad word. But context and circumstances is the key in not sinning using those words. There's a whole bunch of words in there that you could find and say, oh, wow, that's pretty heavy. We're not allowed to use that word in school. Well, it's the reason you're not allowed to use it in various places because it's been used in the wrong context or circumstances. So we have this sticky situation with the Bible. And so what we're going to look at again, I'm going to read this one more time, and you don't have to turn there, but you can. Ephesians 4:29 that we read earlier. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear. The intention is not to offend somebody. There's going to be words that come out that people are offended by because it touches a nerve with their sin. But our intention is for their good. And you've heard it. The Proverbs talk about it all the time, that even a harsh word by a brother is good that he said that he needed to say that to me. We know that. So we're dealing with all the context of all these things. We're dealing with all the context of how we speak, and it has to do with sinning in our speech that would hurt somebody. That's what we're talking about here. So with all this, though, all Christians are called to preach and teach at some capacity. This is the Great Commission, and we see this in Matthew 28:18, the Great Commission, and 1 Corinthians 9:16. Therefore, this whole passage then, as we move on, is a warning to all of us. It's a warning to me all week and beyond. And now, starting today, you need to take this as a warning for you personally. It's for all of us here. And this judgment then that we see in this passage here, the judgment that we see in this passage, that we will be under stricter judgment, has to do with what's called the Bema Seat judgment of Christ. It's the judgment that Christians will be judged on that last day. When the judgment comes for Christians, we're not going to be judged for our sin, but all of our so-called good deeds will be put to the test. And after all the bad stuff is burned off of us, the good deeds that we've done as Christians will be left, and that will be our eternal rewards based on those. And so with that, you can stack up all these great rewards in heaven as a Christian and get them all get them burned down to nothing or down to minimal because you have used your mouth in the wrong way. So that's what we're talking about here. Sinful speech then will take from the rewards that you receive. And here in verse 2a, we see the beginning of verse 2, we see, for we all stumble in many ways. Once again, it's all of us. No one is immune. Proverbs 29, 2 Chronicles 6:36, Romans 3:23, as you know, we are all capable of sinning. So the tongue condemns everyone, especially teachers. That's the first section here. We see in the second section here, the tongue controls. Verse 2, the second half of verse 2 through the beginning of verse 5. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is a perfect man, able to bridle the whole body as well. Now, if we put the bits into the horses' mouths so that they will obey us, we direct their entire body as well. Look at the ships also. They are so great and are driven by strong winds, yet they are still directed by a very small rudder, wherever the inclination of the pilot desires. Wow. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, and yet it boasts of great things. What we see here then is the tongue represents the epitome of the highest need of self-control. If the bridle and the bit can control a big horse, and the rudder can control a big ship, we'll see that our tongue has a lot of power to control a whole bunch of things. It's compared as the same thing. The tongue is able to control and manipulate a whole bunch of things, and it's not very big. So the second half of verse 2, as we saw, it shows us that if one could possibly control the tongue, he could control his whole body. If you can control your mouth, If you can get a hold of your mouth, you can control anything. Jesus did this, because he's perfect, when he was tortured. 1 Peter 2:23. While being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. If anyone was in a situation to speak out and say something nasty with his mouth, it was Jesus, and yet he didn't do it. This is the epitome then of self-control. It means to work on your tongue is a top priority. David said this, Psalm 39:1. I said, I will guard my ways that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle while the wicked are in my presence. Oh man, it's hard to keep your mouth shut when stuff's going on and the wicked are in your presence and somebody needs a tongue lashing, we call it. Wow, David is saying, Lord, guard my tongue. We see in verse 3 and 4 then that if you control the bit, you control the horse. If you control the rudder, you control the ship. Control the tongue, and you can control the whole body. So we see this then in verse 5. So also the tongue is a small part of the body, yet it boasts of great things. Your tongue is like a bully. It's the smallest, yet it boasts of great things like bullies. We know how bullies are. They're generally people that have really low, small self-esteem, and yet their insecurities then cause them to think that they need to go out and be all that. And that's what your tongue does. Your tongue is like a bully. It is really something, as you know, can get slapped down really quick. But it doesn't operate that way. It acts like it can just go and do all these things. And you know how that is. We call it, we use the term popping off. It's going out and just using your tongue to think that you can do all this stuff by saying all this stuff. And with this, though, it hurts relationships. It crushes other people's spirits. And you guys know this. It challenges to fight. The tongue challenges to fight. It is, you've heard this term, then there are fighting words. You've heard that before. And we see this in road rage. We see this in road rage. The road rage is usually, let me say, the catalyst for the road rage is usually gestures that represent words that would come out of your mouth. And we see what happens with the road rage. So the tongue controls people, and the tongue controls circumstances. We also see then in the second half of verse 5, we're going to see that the tongue corrupts. The tongue corrupts. The second half of verse 5. See how great a forest is set aflame by such a small fire? And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and it is set on fire by hell. Wow. So the first part of this section, see how great a forest fire is set on fire by such a small flame. And you've heard this. Smokey the Bear says, only you can prevent forest fires. We know that, most of us from being kids. We also know that one cigarette butt, we learned from these commercials from the National Forest, one cigarette butt or one unattended campfire can start a raging forest fire. So we see that. Such is the tongue. Such is the tongue. Proverbs 26:21 says this, like charcoal to hot embers and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. Wow, you got a guy that starts going in there and popping off with his mouth. And man, the whole place can explode by what somebody says. This is throughout Proverbs 26, Proverbs 16:27, 28, Proverbs 26:20 keeps going. Just as the fire needs fuel, the tongue takes advantage of every and all opportunities to please its owner's sinful heart. Your tongue, as a As if fire is craving fuel, your tongue is looking for opportunities to spout out stuff for the benefit of its wicked heart. It's always looking for stuff to say to make it to benefit the owner's wicked heart. It takes the opportunities to multiply its evil words in the form of many forms, the form of gossip, the form of slander, flattery, rumors, and even planting seeds of doubt or discouragement. How often do you think about that? Words that are harmful, planting seeds of doubt or discouragement of somebody who's already struggling. And even if they might have finally gotten a break and they're finally starting to excel in something, and then you have to go and plant a seed of doubt and knock them down. This is what words can do. David shared this misery constantly about other people's mouths. I mean, constantly. David's a warrior that took down Goliath, and his prayers are constantly about other people's mouths that are hurting him. Once again, he doesn't talk as much about sticks and stones. Psalm 57:4, he says this, "My soul is among lions. I must lie among those who breathe forth fire, even the sons of men, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongues a sharp sword." Wow. This sword is the destroyer tongue. This destroyer tongue does not care about the truth, has no mercy, is worse than sticks and stones. Its words, got to get this, its words are never forgotten, and they are barely forgivable, except by the grace of God, we can forgive. But if it wasn't for the grace of God, you're never going to forget, and you're never going to forgive, except for by the grace of God. The tongue is not afraid of innocence or justice. Not afraid of going against somebody that's completely righteous. Do we know somebody who is completely righteous? Yes, Jesus. The tongue is not afraid to go against somebody that's completely righteous and still spew this stuff out. It's not afraid of justice either. The tongue will just say no accountability. The tongue on its own, it just acts like, hey, nobody's going to do anything to me. The tongue's a bully. The tongue is able to break hearts, ruin families and churches, and ruin reputations. It's able to hurt even the purest, like we talked about with Jesus, and it's able to hurt even the toughest, as we see King David. He was pretty much the toughest at the time, and yet it could hurt him. It can even hurt its owner. Well, you should be more concerned about hurting God and others first, but just in case you're not, it will hurt you too. Proverbs talks about it all over, but Proverbs 18:6 and 7 says, "A fool's lips bring strife, and his mouth calls for blows." Blows are basically punching in the teeth, is what that means. In other words, the fool's lips bring strife, and his mouth calls for blows. He's asking for trouble. A fool's mouth is his ruin, and his lips are the snare of his soul, is in that proverb that we see. We see in verse 6 then, "And the tongue is a fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life, and it is set on fire by hell." This part here, the very world of iniquity, this is in verse 6. That means that all the evil of the world system can come out of a small member of the body. All the nasty stuff in the whole world can all come together and get spewed out of your mouth. Wow. The iniquity of this world can come out of your mouth. It's that evil. It contains then all the world's potential evil in one little muscle. Then it says here, it is set among our members. It means that it has been given charge over the rest of our bodies, claiming its own authority. How many times have you said this? My mouth is my worst enemy. Like, what? It's taken over. It's a bully. As that which defiles the entire body, it contaminates then the entire body like cancer does. The smell of its smoke never goes away from the owner's entire being. If you've ever you've been camping, it's kind of neat to have the smell of smoke on you because it reminds you of the cool campfire that you had. But if you have your house burnt down or a fire in your house, the smoke will never go away to remind you of what happened with that terrible, scary fire. That's the way the tongue is. It sets on fire the course of your life. In other words, it puts one's life on a vicious cycle that cannot be exited by the natural man. You cannot get off that ride. When your tongue starts going, you are on a vicious cycle. It sets your course of your life, and you cannot get away from it. It owns you. Its words cannot be retrieved once they're fired off. They're gone, and there's nothing you could do about it. They're gone. And you could only hope that God's grace on the other person that you sinned against can cause them to forget and to forgive. It's that corrupt. What he spoke or you speak will never go away. It will never go away. The reputation of the owner's mouth follows him wherever he goes. And this is the reason, because it is set on fire by hell, it says. Means its evil source is hell, which is constantly, because it is set on fire, constantly is what it says. That's what it means, which is constantly maintaining its flame. You have a pilot light go out and you think, okay, I got to relight it. It's like, no. You don't have to worry about relighting your tongue. Hell will relight your tongue constantly. Hell is known as the unquenchable fire, Isaiah 66:24. Jesus talked about hell more than he talked about heaven, Matthew 5:22 and Mark 9. Therefore, this tongue, this is the tool of Satan, who is the murderer and the father of lies. It's his tool. It's not. If it's his tool, that means that you're not owning it yourself. With this then, the natural man's tongue allegiance is towards the three enemies of God and his people. Your tongue's allegiance, if you're not a Christian, is naturally bent to be an allegiance to or help the three enemies of God and Christians. The three enemies of God and Christians are listed in Ephesians 2:1-10. Your three enemies as a Christian is the world system, Satan himself, and your own self, your own flesh. And those things, your tongue has allegiance towards those three things, against God and against others. That's what your natural tongue is bent towards. It is constantly relit by hell, therefore participating with Satan. It reflects our own sinful hearts, therefore our flesh, and it represents the present evil system of the world. And so it's an enemy of God and his people. So the tongue corrupts the owner and everyone around him permanently. The tongue corrupts. Now, the tongue challenges, and we've talked about that. Verse 7, for every species of beasts and birds, of reptiles and creatures of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by the human race. But no one could tame the tongue. It is a restless evil and full of deadly poison. You guys saw this in Genesis 6. Noah was able to actually get every single animal on the ship that was required. In other words, every single species of animal, Noah was able to get on the ship. But the tongue challenges, defies, and rebels against God and man more than even the toughest animal that you are trying to train. It boldly proclaims, as we see in Psalm 10:6, it boldly proclaims, I will not be moved. You're carrying around a bully that is even putting himself over you. That's what the tongue is. It is volatile, which means it's ready to explode at any moment. It is restless, unstable, wild, undisciplined, irresponsible, uncontrollable. It is savagely, is what your tongue is in the natural man. It is filled with deadly venom, worse than any snake. The lies of the tongue have devastated people for years. Stories in the Bible. Lies slaughtered 85 innocent priests in 1 Samuel 22. Lies put this innocent man, Naboth, to death so that Jezebel and Ahab could take his vineyard. Lies put Jesus to death on the cross, Matthew 26 and throughout. A lie put Stephen to death because he was preaching the truth in Acts 6. Keep in mind, a snake's venom can kill the body, but the tongue can hurt the spirit more than even physical death. The tongue will cause you to say, I wish I was dead. Even if it's something that you regret saying, or that you said to somebody else that might feel that way now that you've heard them that bad, that they might look at it like, man, I'd rather die than have said that, or I'd rather die than have heard that. The snake or any other deadly animal is not necessarily evil. The snake isn't necessarily evil, but the tongue is evil. It cannot be tamed, but it must be tamed. It requires being born again, having the Holy Spirit. Otherwise, it's impossible. You cannot tame the natural man's tongue. It cannot happen. David knew this required prayer. Again, he prays. Psalm 141. Let a guard, O Lord, over my mouth. Keep watch over the door of my lips. It's constantly recognizing and being proactive, what we see here. And David also prayed against the tongues of his enemies as they were inciting others against him. Psalm 64, 1 through 10. He saw the damage that the tongue could do for himself and for others, and how the tongue damaged him. So the tongue challenges, therefore it requires even drastic action to shut it down. We see that Jesus talked about drastic action. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to look at somebody in a way that you shouldn't, gouge it out. This is super important here about our tongue, the drastic measures we need to take as Christians. Verse 9, 3:9. The tongue compromises. With it, we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come both blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not to be like this. He goes on in verse 11. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Nor can salt water produce fresh. He's asking questions with the answer of, no, that can't happen. We know that a fountain can't set forth both water. A fig tree can't produce both kinds of fruit. We know these things. The tongue compromises integrity as it does both good and evil. It quickly adapts to the circumstances at hand for the benefit of its owner's evil desires. Through bullying, now catch this, these are different ways that your tongue adapts to the situation for your personal benefit. In the long run, as we said, isn't your personal benefit, but you're fooled into thinking it does. Through bold bullying on one hand, is something that you could do with your tongue, to sneaky lying and slander, which is in the middle, to the other extreme, to deceitful flattery. Oh, they sound so nice, and then in the meantime, it's for the sake of just accomplishing something. So your tongue can adapt to all situations by flat out bullying on one hand, and then in the middle, the sneaky lying and the sneaky slandering, and on the other hand, the flat out boldly saying, kissing up to somebody to get something from them, which is lying also. So we see that it can be used for all these different things. Whatever the need of the moment, The tongue is very versatile, and it's a flip-flopper. It is ready to adapt to whatever the heart wants and to say whatever it supposedly is going to help the person, your own person. Therefore, it's hypocritical. It is polluted if it's used for evil. And with this, you got to remember this, and this goes back to regret. But we can start now. With this, anything good that you say is tainted by the memory of the evil that your tongue has spouted in the past. In other words, now you're saying, I'm going to use my tongue for good, but the bottom line is, well, yesterday you said this, so I'm still tainted by the fact that you're saying this now, but it's tainted by what you said yesterday. This is sticky. Verse 10, yet from the same mouth comes both blessings and cursing. Okay, so it's talking about the way that it can be used both ways. And to curse means to persecute or abuse someone who's made in the image of God, which Jesus calls as murder. Jesus calls this as being murder. Matthew 5:21, in hating your brother and cursing your brother is the same as murder. God commanded Noah that the death penalty would be for the murderer, those who are made in his image. Genesis 9:6. This is a big deal. If you're cursing your brother and Jesus calls it murder, and God says that murder, it means you're guilty of the death penalty, it's serious business here. We are to bless both God and those who are made in his image, is what we're supposed to do, is bless them. And this is the constant struggle that all of us will have, including Peter and Paul. They both failed, in fact. We have documentation of their failing. Peter cursed Jesus when he denied him. Matthew 26. Paul cursed the high priest, which represented God, in Acts 23. But both repented, and so can we. So we see the cry of James then in verse 10. He said, my brethren, these things ought not to be this way. In other words, our tongue must be consistently used for good. Jesus taught us, let your yes be yes and your no be no without hypocrisy. Matthew 5:37. It can't be used for flip-flopping all over the place. A bad heart cannot produce anything good. But with a Christian, his tongue should represent a heart that's been regenerated, being born again. Here we go, once again with James. If it walks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. James is calling us out to examine ourselves. And once we examine ourselves to recognize what other people are in the Lord, or who claim to be in the Lord, once again we see this. A true Christian will be seen as one who attempts to tame his own tongue. Who attempts. It's impossible to do it perfect, other than Jesus doing it perfect. But a true Christian will be seen as one who attempts to do this. And with this, then, the tongue compromises, and therefore it can't be trusted. You can't trust your own tongue because it's going to flip-flop and say something that you can't just let it go and do its own thing. So what we see here then, James 3 in this passage, 1 through 12, gives us 5 reasons why you must tame the untamable tongue so that you will bless God and others and even in yourself. The tongue condemns everyone, especially teachers. The tongue controls people and circumstances. The tongue corrupts the owner and everyone around permanently. The tongue challenges, therefore requires even drastic action to shut it down. The tongue compromises, therefore it can't be trusted. A teacher will be under stricter judgment, but for all Christians, any unwholesome talk will cause question as to the validity of your salvation. You should and will be judged by man and by God. The Apostle Paul speaks on this, Colossians 3, 8-10. But now you also put them all aside. Anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. Colossians 3, 8 through 10. Let's pray.